Hello. Scotland's biggest city, Glasgow, hosted the UN Climate Conference in 2021, that was COP26. And this week, the Conference of the Parties number 29 takes place in another oil producing country, Azerbaijan. Last Saturday, that's the 16th of November, a range of noisy and colourful groups took over the steps in Glasgow's Buchanan Street to mark the lack of progress at the Baku talks. So why this demonstration? Well, for one thing, the leader of Latin America's second biggest economy, Javier Milei of Argentina, sent his delegation home after just 4 days of talks. The host country's president, Ilham Aliyev, has already praised Azerbaijan's fossil fuel resource as a gift from God. Panama's Environment Minister Juan Carlos Navarro said that he is not encouraged by what he's seen in the first week of this year's COP. All talk and very little action, in his words. He noted that Panama, like many other developing countries, is among the least responsible for the climate crisis, but the most vulnerable to the damage caused. That remark introduces the loss and damage agenda, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. But first, what's the purpose of these once-a-year UN meetings? The current international move aimed at limiting global warming can reasonably be traced back to the Kyoto Protocol from December 1997, signed by 192 parties. That means both countries or international bodies like the EU. This agreement put into effect the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change, where all the bodies who signed accepted two principles. Firstly, that they should all do what they can to limit emissions of greenhouse gases, and secondly, what they called differentiated responsibility, which really means what the Panamanian minister said, that the richest and most polluting countries should carry the most of the burden. The Kyoto Agreement also included the target for greenhouse gas emissions using 1990 as the base year. Total emissions had to be reduced by 5% over a 5-year period, with tighter restrictions coming in for future years. At first, the 37 biggest economies were to carry out the majority of the reductions. In July this year, the UN announced that the developed countries had achieved an average of 22% reductions. The EU managed to reduce by 23%, while Britain actually reduced by 30% compared to 1990 levels. Progress, eh? The problem is it's still getting hotter. If things don't change, our planet is heading for a disastrous 2-degree rise towards the end of the century, bringing more violent storms, wildfires, flooding, and loss of species. There's two reasons for this. Firstly, built-in warming. We've been burning coal, oil, and gas on a literally industrial scale for 1.5 centuries, so that will continue even if we stop tomorrow. And secondly, the global majority nations, including China, Brazil, and India, have not felt compelled to mitigate their emissions as much unless the rich countries do more or offer to compensate developing nations for their loss and damage. News for Scotland is a not-for-profit media company based in Glasgow and launched just under a year ago. We're still growing, and as a first step, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you want to help this part of Scotland's alternative media, you can, and it costs you nothing. Just click on the subscribe button. That's a red one that you'll see on your YouTube page. Thanks. Now back to the annual COP summits. The general aim is to monitor progress on the emissions agreements we all signed up to in Paris. That agreement from 2015 put a limit of 2 degrees on total global warming, with the advice that if possible, total warming should not go above 1.5 degrees, but the planet is already very close to that limit. The Paris Agreement means that countries who signed up have to deliver. National plans have to be drawn up to show how those targets were being met. These plans are called the Nationally Determined Contributions, or the NDCs, and one of the tasks of each new COP summit is to check on progress. Both Keir Starmer and the Scottish Government are committed to reaching net zero by the middle of this century. The UK's NDCs are a reserved matter, of course, but Starmer did tell the COP delegates last week what we are aiming for, an 81% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2035. An extremely difficult target. The UK's Independent Climate Change Committee supports the ambition but are sceptical about delivery. That would mean a faster switch towards electric cars, more domestic heat pumps, plus more tree planting, and restoration of nature such as peatlands, nature's natural store of CO2. Today, about 1% of our homes has a heat pump, but it needs to be 10% at least. And soon, 16.5% of our cars today are electric. The CCC advises that needs to change to be virtually all cars electric within 10 years. It can be done with the right political will. The Carbon Change Committee says these measures are already popular in Norway, where a transition to EVs has already been happening, and people with a heat pump are happy with it. In Norway, the tipping point has been reached. EV cars are now cheaper than those pulled by their CO2 emitting engines. Finally, on the Paris Agreement, it was vital to get America on board, and they stayed in until June 2017, when President Trump announced an end to America's participation. However, legally they couldn't pull out right away, and as soon as Joe Biden took office in 2020, he signed the US back in again. Presumably President Trump Mark II will once again walk away. Now, what about loss and damage? The idea that rich countries who caused the problem will help the poorer victims. Both at COP26 in Glasgow and COP27 in Egypt, the environmental agenda talked about an environmental fund to direct investment towards the developing nations. COP28 in Dubai saw the US, Japan, Britain and the EU pledge $430 million into the fund, and the Emirates also put in $100 million. From the Glasgow summit onwards, the key aim of this finance has been to defend countries from the worst effects of the present and worsening hostile climate. This could include early warning systems for severe weather events, to investing in new crops resistant to the new hotter growing conditions. Both here and around the world, we have to accept not only that climate change is here now and getting worse, but that we can't avoid its damaging effects, so we need to be ready. COP29 is still going on, and frequently deals get made at the last minute of these, but each member nation has a job to do. Here in Scotland, we have a choice. What about the Grangemouth oil refinery? If it stops making petrol and diesel, is that a good thing? Unions and politicians here insist it should stay open, but what should the plant make? Will Aberdeen continue as an oil capital, or do we have to say goodbye to those 20th century industries and shift serious money into the new green fuels and transport? What do you say? We welcome comments, which you can add just below, and you can hit that subscribe button while you're there. Okay, finally, let's have another look at last Saturday's lively demonstration in Glasgow. This is XR Disobedience. I'm Hugh, this is News for Scotland. Thank you for watching. We'll be back soon.